Thank you for joining us for episode 35 of Galaxy Tenants, where we head to Denver, Colorado for a conversation about epilepsy with Dr. Ed Ma, a neurologist at Denver Health. As well, we feature Put Some Mustard on It and Big Smoke by 5 Alarm Funk.
I'm joined today by Dr. Ed Ma. Thank you so much for joining me today, Dr. Ma.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Let's start by talking about epilepsy, what it is, and kind of what causes it.
Well, epilepsy is essentially the final common pathway to a lot of bad things that can happen in your brain. There's not one thing that causes it, but in the end, what happens at the level of the brain is that a certain area becomes very irritable, and then it sort of recruits its neighbors, and with a sort of overwhelming electrical excitation sort of produces a rhythmic pattern that will basically engulf the entire brain if allowed to, or limit its spread if your brain is able to sort of squash the hyperexcitation.
How did you get into studying and working on epilepsy?
Well, that's a little bit of an interesting story. I actually fell in love with neurology in medical school based on the clinical examination that they do at LSU. The department head, Dr. Austin Sumner, was this beautiful diagnostician. He would walk around with a gaggle of medical students. We would ask a couple of questions. He would tap a couple of reflexes and then just start to ask people, based on this very limited information that we had, what we thought was happening. We would always do this on rounds, and then he would come up with this masterful sort of diagnosis, and then we would go to the MRI, and lo and behold, he was always right. It was a lot of fun. It was the sort of exciting, part of medical diagnostics, just with your wits and your knowledge of the human body. It was very, very exciting. So I got into neurology and then discovered fairly quickly that many of the fields within neurology are really kind of challenging from an emotional perspective because there was not a lot we can do. And so within the realm of neurology, I did find epilepsy a very exciting field in which medications were being developed at a breathtaking pace. Our knowledge of the neural networks were expanding very quickly. Epilepsy surgeries were curing people. And so I basically fell in love with epilepsy from that perspective, because it's something that you could really change somebody's life, from somebody who's afraid to leave their home, walk their dog, because every time they have a seizure outside, the dog would run away, to somebody who was essentially cured and, return back to tax-paying status, fully employed, having normal relationships, being able to drive, go to school, do all the things that we normally think of as having a normal life.
I've been reading a little bit about epilepsy and some of the treatments, and one of the things that I kind of found interesting was that conventional treatments don't work in some cases on approximately 30% of people.
That's correct, yeah. And those numbers haven't really changed. Since the Kwan and Brody studies in the early 80s, the percentage of people who are not controlled by medications alone has been, stuck at that sort of stubborn 30 to 33% that we typically quote.
That feels like a high percentage. Is that the case? I mean, is that okay? Yeah,
that is a high percentage. At the same time, the general neurologist doesn't necessarily see a ton of those super refractory folks. And for the most part, it's very rewarding. You see somebody who has had a few seizures, you start a medication, they do great, they go on about their business. And, folks like Elton John, Prince, people who've had seizures, have seizures, well controlled, you never even know. It's not a big issue for them. But for those third that we can't control with medications, it's very, very challenging. And that's why people who focus on epilepsy tend to gravitate toward that, end of things.
Sure. That being said, one of the things that you've studied that is very interesting to me is cannabis and the way cannabis treats epilepsy. Can you talk a little bit about the studies that you were involved in and what you took from these studies?
Yeah, it's actually a fairly circuitous route, as you sort of might imagine. I came to Colorado in 2002 to begin my neurology residency. And even from back then, because Colorado, shortly after California, had legalized medical marijuana use, people were sort of trickling into clinic and saying, hey, I just tried this thing and I stopped seizing. And, the first couple, reports of it were really, really exciting. And then as, the years went by, fewer people would tell me how awesome it was. And there wasn't a lot going on. But I was interested in sort of alternative medicines based on that sort of conversation. And I did a sort of a literature review for a grand rounds that I gave as a fellow in 2005, 2006 time period. And so I did quite a bit of the search of what was out there in the literature about Dr. Mitchullam and all of that sort of early work done in Israel and Brazil, because obviously that work wasn't really being done here.
Mm-hmm.
It was fascinating. And what I found was, especially for epilepsy, which is what I was obviously looking for, was that the ability to tamp down seizures in a lot of the mouse models that we typically use to identify a medication's effectiveness were equivalent with THC, with CBD, some of those other lesser-known constituents at the time. And so I thought, well, that's interesting. People are reporting this. This may be an explanation why. And sort of it dropped from there. And then the whole Charlotte's Web thing happened to Colorado. Dr. Gupta came, interviewed Charlotte Figge, Paige Figge, did the whole expose. And all of a sudden things changed. People were super interested.
I found it just really interesting how Sanjay Gupta changed his entire tune after that experience and his interactions with Charlotte and the folks who were cultivating the CBD heavy cannabis for her. I found that to be super fascinating because he took a very opposite approach prior to that.
Well, and I think the opposite approach is the one we sort of all train with. If something's good for everything, it's probably good for nothing, right? And so you hear the things, and it's easy to make those assumptions unless you do the deep dive into the medical literature and you actually have a background to really interpret some of that stuff. It's hard to understand, how that would even be possible. And so it seems very mystical, very magical, and so it's easy sort of to poo-poo it. But I think once you sort of see it, you see what these folks are doing, what they've been through, and the fact that these aren't sort of quacks who don't want to even try traditional therapies. These folks have been through the ringer. They've been through everything that Western medicine had to offer, and now here's where they were. It's not like they sort of shortcutted anything. And I would say that's a little bit different these days, but in the early days, these people had no other options. I forget exactly. I haven't reviewed her data in a while, but Charlotte, I think, again, she had Dravet.
Mm-hmm.
She passed away earlier this year, but she, I think she was on, she had tried or been exposed to 13 medications, ketogenic diet 2 or 3 times, some really extreme things with very little impact over time. Again, I didn't follow her directly. I'm an adult neurologist, and so, everything sort of needs to be flavored with that caveat.
What I found to be interesting was that the drug she was taking had very little impact on her amount or volume of seizures. And then as soon as cannabis was used, it dropped dramatically, just staggering numbers from I think it was like hundreds down to a handful of seizures a day. I mean, and I don't quote me on the actual numbers.
Yeah, and I would say that we do see that on occasion in epilepsy, where somebody who's tried all the traditional medications and you try something new that they've never seen before, you do have a very dramatic response. The thing that's convincing is when you pull that back and then the response is reversed. And so, that was my initial take. Okay, this is just a new mechanism. We don't exactly know what it does. Sure, she's gotten better. It's very clinically obvious that she has gotten better.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe it's a fluke, or maybe it's what we call kind of a honeymoon. A lot of these, you add a new drug, you do great. 2 months later, 3 months later, 6 months later, everything's back to normal again. But what at the time that I had met Paige Figge, she was already, I think, 9 to 12 months into her sort of journey. And she had already pulled back 3 times on her own just to see, because she didn't believe it either. Again, these parents become very, very skeptical of anything that's working because they've just been disappointed so many times in their life. And so, again, taking her history at her word, she pulled back. And I think her report is anytime that she got below 2 milligrams of CBD per pound, Charlotte's seizures came back again, sort of ferociously. And so, and just to be clear, she was never fully seizure free, and we didn't really impact her neurocognitive course, dramatically. Now, I think her physical function, her ability to communicate improved, But we weren't going to reverse the Dravet. We were just going to stop the seizures and hopefully allow as much that was underneath there to come out as possible, which is, I think, what she was able to enjoy toward the end of her life.
Mm-hmm. With the use of cannabis to treat epilepsy, there's these multiple aspects of cannabis in tetrahydrocannabinol or THC, and then there's cannabidiol with CBD. It seems that CBD is most commonly used to treat seizures. And I saw that the FDA approved, I'm going to butcher this one, Epidiolex?
Epidiolex, yeah.
Epidiolex, okay. Is there value in THC to treat this, or is it really CBD that is the strongest component that would be utilized to treat epilepsy?
It's a big controversy. I mean, I think what we know, because FDA has reviewed the studies, GW Pharma has done all of the appropriate studies, and just in full disclosure, actually, I give medical talks for them sometimes about their product. But I think the science, as far as we can tell, for CBD is settled. But, I think there is some part of it that we don't know. And, again, the two major sort of theories is, you need the full spectrum plant. Each of these components help each other versus, you need just one component and it does all the heavy lifting. And I think there's probably some truth in both of these things, because the clinical effect at the quantity that she was using, I think, is 1/10 the dose of Epidiolex. And so then the question is, well, is it because the other constituents are actually helping? This concept of one of the early scientists of the entourage effect. Do you need all of these separate components? Now, I think the one agent side has felt like they've debunked the entourage argument, and the other side says, no, you haven't. And so I think this is not fully settled in my mind, or I haven't read anything super convincing that is settled yet. I think it would be great to put these products head to head and settle it. But
sure.
Nobody wants to pay for that.
Right. No, that's fair. So I've noticed that when I take CBD products or utilize CBD products, they are not as effective as the products that contain a portion THC. That is what I've found from my experience. But I would love to see that tested and just end this conversation, so that if CBD alone isn't that effective, it's not being marketed and sold without that other component of THC.
Yeah, and again, I think it depends on the disease states that's being treated. If you look at purely epilepsy and a certain type of epilepsy, I think you can answer those questions. Do you need both, or do you need one? Do you need one equivalent doses or its own independent dose? I mean, I think those are very legitimate questions. People who use it for pain, people who use it for sleep, people who use it for mood-related things, I think those are, again, because we don't fully understand every single receptor and every single contact point that these cannabinoids have in our body, I think it's difficult to sort of make generalized statements about what it does for people in general. I think we need to be very clear about, okay, is this helpful for migraine? Is this helpful for insomnia? And then study those people sort of in that way. And again, that's a very Western approach to medicine, as opposed to the Eastern approach of, okay, this person's out of balance. Let me give you something to bring you back in balance after I assess you, and make a very specific patient-specific diagnosis. It's a very different strategy of health. And so I think that's where we have this conflict. Marijuana has always sort of straddled in between, because it can do both things for both groups.
Let's talk a little bit about the negative side of cannabis, because I've been using cannabis regularly and constantly for 20 or so years. I mean, I'm a kind of user that uses it from the moment I wake up till the moment I go to bed. And I find that for me personally, the benefits are wonderful. I think more clearly. I'm more relaxed. I'm not as anxious. I sleep better. I find myself to be a better person.
Yeah, I don't doubt that that's the case. I think the problem is the conversation gets clouded and too broadly applied. I think the information about pediatric exposure is fairly compelling that it's a bad idea. And actually, I would sort of share with you an experience I had, completely unrelated, but you sort of reminded me of it.
Sure.
When Sky and I were on our honeymoon in South Africa, we actually spent some time and, actually got to be married again in a Zulu village.
Wow.
Part of the experience, that we sort of signed up for was that the men sort of took the men, the women took the women. They taught each person part of their tribal sort of rituals. And so my only job, so poor Sky, she had to learn like 15 different songs in Zulu, all these different patterns of dance. I was literally just sitting with the boys drinking this beer in this sort of like a hut-like thing. And we were just passing this ladle around. And again, I can't believe I did this, given when we got married and the HIV rates come back then. but I did it. It was part of the thing. But in the midst of this sort of like, drunken haze of just this, this beer being passed around, I was noticing, literally the weeds inside this hut. And I said, hey, that looks like marijuana. And they go, it is. And I was just like, wow, do you guys just like, it just grows everywhere? And they said, yes, it's literally a weed. And then I asked them, if everyone used it. He says, no, only the elders are allowed to use it. You have to be older than, I think it was 35 or 40. And wow. I think given how ubiquitous it is their understanding generationally through, oral culture, they've probably learned what we have sort of through science learned, that giving cannabis too early to somebody does bad things to their brain. So, I think waking baking in your 30s and 40s, if that's your thing, that's your thing. Mm-hmm. I think if somebody who's 18 takes that lesson from somebody who's older, I think that can be very dangerous. And we definitely do see that.
Sure, because the brain in a young adult is still developing till about what age? What are we? 35. Okay, wow. Yeah. Well, I've got a lot of time in prior to that, so it'll be interesting to see what the results are as I get older. I wonder, does it tie into long-term cognitive issues? Is there, you hear about the memory loss and all that associated with it. I have not experienced that. I feel like an elephant as far as my memory goes. I'm sure later on there could be issues.
Well, I think, people have different physiology. And, there are people, I remember George Burns, he smoked a cigar every day of his life until he died at like 80 or whatever. Some people just don't sort of follow that typical pattern. But when you talk about Western medicine, we look at sort of population-based statistics. And, I think in general, if you start too young, and what's too young? I don't know that number. Again, I don't do, adolescent psych. I don't do any of that kind of stuff. But my feeling, my understanding from talking to people who are in that world is, 25, 27, 30, fine. 15, 16, 18, not fine. Where's that sort of, that point in between? I think it sort of depends on the person and who they are and who their family is and what their conditions that run in their family. And I think, schizophrenia, one of the things that I've seen a couple times just through consultation is one of those things that, if you have a lot of it in your family, be very, very careful.
Sure.
This can unleash it, it seems. Sure. Yeah.
Good. If you don't,
who knows?
I don't, so I'm holding out hope that everything will be okay and I can continue these habits ongoing.
Yeah. No, the fact that you were more on time for this interview than me suggests that this has not impacted you in the way that we typically think,
Well, I appreciate that sentiment. let's shift gears and get out of my love of talking about cannabis, and let's dive into just a little bit about what you're working on now with dogs and sniffing out epilepsy. I just did some brief reading on this morning, and I was so intrigued about what I read regarding the high accuracy, in some cases 100% with these dogs. And I found it to be super interesting that they were detecting seizures 45 minutes prior to their occurring, and from different subjects who are having different kinds of seizures. And you're still seeing this 100% rate in some of these dogs as far as accuracy. I find that to be so impressive. How do you train the dog to detect that there is a seizure coming on?
Yeah, so this is a longer story too. So initially, when dog training programs started noticing this, and patients who started acquiring dogs to help them with their medical conditions started noting, everyone was super excited, and we were trying to study it, trying to figure out what was going on. Was the dog learning the behavior of the person? Were they smelling something? Were they sort of observing a change in expression? Were they actually just responding to the seizure? None of that was very well known. And so a lot of the early reports just descriptively sort of reported those findings. And so that led down the road to, okay, we have an epilepsy monitoring unit. This is where we bring people into the hospital, remove their medications, have them have seizures for a variety of different reasons. And so I can get into that later. That's a more complicated conversation. But in those settings, you can have the dog there and see, okay, the video showed the dog is responding at time X. The seizure happened at time Y. Is there a relationship? And what happened was, in the first couple reports, people started doing that kind of study. What they noticed is that the dog would alert, and then the patient would respond. And what they responded with was not actually a seizure, but what we call a non-epileptic seizure. It's a psychiatric diagnosis that falls in the category of conversion disorder. And so that's one of the reasons why we use epilepsy monitoring units. Some people have events that people don't know why they're not responding to seizure meds, and because it's not epilepsy. It's more of a mental health disorder. And again, I could talk about that too. That's a separate conversation. But when these reports came out, then all of a sudden said, okay, well, never mind, that doesn't work. The dogs are just producing non-epileptic seizures, and the people who wanted to are more likely to have trouble with their seizure, are more likely to go get a dog, and those kinds of things. And so the medical community and the epilepsy community sort of suddenly lost interest for a long, long time. I think what's happened is a couple different things. The dog scent literature, bomb sniffing, drug sniffing, body recovery in earthquakes, that literature is very robust, and they've gone to great lengths to sort of identifying what it is that they're smelling. Secondly, Canine Assistance, a epilepsy dog training program in Atlanta. The owner, who I've become since very good friends with, she didn't believe those that were coming out about non-epileptic seizures, and she said, these dogs over time are learning their patients. Something's happening beforehand, and that's where some of those timed things that you read about. And so what she did was she personally funded research, and she collaborated with Florida International University in a PhD program to identify, what it was, because she had a very strong belief that the dogs were identifying a scent rather than some sort of behavior. And so what they did was they recruited several patients who had epilepsy, and they took sweat samples, basically literally underarm sweat samples, put it into a bag, breathed into the bag, and then sealed it hermetically, and then shipped it off to the chemistry lab. And through the magic of chemistry, they were able to do gas chromatography studies and identify this spectrum of all the scents that were in there. And then what they did, they took I think it was 11 patients, and identified which ones were common to just those 11, not during the interictal time period when the seizures were happening, but only during the ictal time period. And they came up with 9 different scents, something called volatile organic compounds, 3 of which were unique to all of them.
Wow.
Breath and sweat. And so what they did was, and they purified that, or they actually sort of created a scent profile, and then trained the canine assistance dogs to identify that. And so what we have just completed, and I've submitted the manuscript a month ago, I haven't heard word back yet. But we prospectively trained those. It took those dogs who've been trained to recognize that specific scent. And in the epilepsy monitoring unit at Denver Health, we actually took sweat samples in people we were admitting for epilepsy monitoring. So we were sort of sequentially taking sweat samples, whether they had seizures or not, and then sort of bottling them up in a way that would survive the shipping to Atlanta. And then they would open it up, let the dog smell, yes, no, and then we created a massive table of data points, and then they shipped it back to us. I looked at the EEG and video and identified when seizures actually occurred, and we merged those two data sets. And the data has been really sort of exciting.
Wow.
Yeah, so in conclusion, the scent appears to be very accurately identified, not 100%, but I'd say like 70 to 80%. And it actually seems to be present about 60 to 70 minutes before a clinical seizure occurs, and then lasts for another 30 to 40 minutes afterwards.
Wow. And that kind of a heads up, I mean, you're talking, that's life-saving. That's
game changing.
Yeah, that's huge.
It's huge. It's huge. I mean, not that I would advocate it, but that's the kind of time warning that somebody who had epilepsy and not purely well controlled might still be able to safely drive.
Wow.
Wow. Which is a big deal.
Wow. And then the closer you get to the timing of the actual seizure, you're still giving people a heads up to be able to get to a safe or comfortable place, right, or to get their medication prior to this happening. Exactly. I mean, that's so amazing. That work is so amazing.
Yeah. It's just scientific progression. You take one little interesting thing, you test it. You take the result of that, you test that. And so that's kind of where we've gotten. And, hopefully that study gets published. And I think it's a lot of interest in it. Hopefully that study gets published and, we can do some really powerful things with that information.
So let's go back to when you were talking about bringing folks in and removing the medication so that they will have seizures. Mm-hmm. It's got to come with some stress on your end, taking that approach. Yeah. But the big picture is that you're going to be able to study these folks, these people, mm-hmm, and the data that you get from that will outweigh, mm-hmm, the negative of hopefully these folks having some pretty serious seizures off medication, correct?
Yes, and ideally they don't have serious seizures because they're in the hospital setting. We can intervene very quickly. But yes, it can happen. It does happen. It has happened before. What
does intervention look like in a patient that is seizing in a hospital as far as what you can do there as opposed to in a home setting?
Well, first of all, you can prevent them falling out of bed or, getting wrapped up in their sheets and sort of tangling, ending up face down in a compromised position and not able to sort of get to us, where they can breathe. Mm-hmm. So pure nursing is the most important key that you can't do at home. But, again, and this goes back to that third of people that are controlled. This epilepsy monitoring unit is for that, group of folks. So epileptologists, neurologists who go on to train to do, specialty epilepsy are working in the setting of an epilepsy monitoring unit to say, okay, this person's having uncontrolled spells. What are they? And so we bring them in and we try to provoke them. Or if they're very frequent anyway, we don't have to remove medications. And so, the primary three functions of the epilepsy monitoring unit are to remove medications and localize where seizure is coming from to see if we can perform surgery to cure their epilepsy, or try to understand a little bit fishy, is that epilepsy or is it not epilepsy? And so then we can remove the medications and see that too. Mm-hmm. And the third, more rare use is to see, okay, this person has epilepsy, they're on these medications, they live alone, we don't really know how well they're doing. Let's bring them in and see. We'll record them for a week, and we know they're getting their medications and we know where they are on the video, and we can see, okay, indeed, this person's doing well, or, oh, as I thought, they're having lots of seizures and sleep and they don't know about it.
How far off are we from that 30% plus figure being brought down to a manageable or a reasonable amount relative to other ailments and medications and procedures? How far off are we to having treatments for those folks so we don't have to look at that daunting number of 30% of individuals experiencing this?
It's a good question. They've redone those early 1980s studies, I think 3 times officially now, and that number has not budged. For an individual, we are doing a lot better with epilepsy surgeries, with medical devices. The device market is improving. 20 years ago, we had one device. Now we have 3 devices, and maybe more on the way. So for an individual, it's very exciting. I think if we have this conversation 15, 20 years from now, we'll have more sort of population-based statistics. But in the last iteration, I think in the late 90s, early 2000s, we haven't really budged that number.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about just COVID briefly and how that's affected the work that you're doing and Denver Health as a whole.
Yeah. Obviously, COVID has been sort of a shock to the medical system, and it's a pandemic. And so we don't want people to die. We want people to do the right thing, stay socially distant, wear your mask, don't go out if you don't need to, and wash your hands and don't do silly stuff. Everyone knows what we're supposed to do. People are paying attention to that depending on, whether or not they believe it or not. How that manifests in the hospital is, in the early wave, when we knew nothing about it, people were getting very sick, and we just didn't have the comfort to treat it as well. And so I think people that were treated then, maybe had they gotten it later, we might have done a better job. But obviously the death rate's been very high and unacceptably so. I think in the early wave, it took out a lot of the less healthy folks in our community and the elderly folks in our community. And so now the infection rate is climbing again, but the death rate and the hospital utilization rate is not as scary. It's at least more predictable now that we have, 8 months under our belt.
What are we looking at as far as the case fatality rate now in Colorado? Are you familiar with that figure?
Yeah, I'm not. Actually, I just saw the hospital figures. Let's see, at the peak, we had like 888 hospital patients at Denver Health, and now we're down to like 200. At the best, we had 30.
Mm-hmm.
In the May-June time period, we were doing great. And then school opened up, colleges opened up, and so it might have started again that way, but now it sort of has its own momentum in the community again. And I think just yesterday, DPS said, hey, we're out. Middle school and high school are staying home.
I saw that. Why? I wondered when I saw that why it would be that the younger individuals in the elementary program would still do in-person learning. Is that just because they're less susceptible?
It's a great question, and I think it's confusing. Mm-hmm. I think it's a cost-benefit analysis. I think the transmission rate is actually fairly high in that group. They don't get super sick, and so we don't know. We don't test them. But the detriment of them going to school online for such a long time, I think, is what's weighing down on the sort of meta conversations now. The pediatric groups, everyone's just like, the psychological damage of keeping a kid isolated for this long may actually now start to outweigh, the pandemic risk. And so, again, I'm not privy to those conversations. That's my own sort of personal take. Mm-hmm. I don't think they're less infectious. In fact, I think they may actually be more infectious. But, they don't get sick, or, they look like they're always, oh, it's fall. They got a runny nose. Yeah, whatever. And so we don't test that.
Right.
Yeah. And so I don't know that we know.
Well, thank you so much for having this conversation with me. I'm so grateful for the work you're doing. Thank you so much for clarifying some of this stuff for me and giving me a little bit more of a perspective than I had prior to this conversation.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you for listening to Galaxy Tenants. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, like, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts. For early access to episodes and exclusive content, check us out on Patreon. Also, if you'd like to communicate with us, send an email to galaxytenants@gmail.com or leave a voicemail on the Galaxy Tenants hotline at 303-550-2065.
You've reached the Galaxy Tenants hotline. Please leave a message.